Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping pretty much headfirst into one of the most complex and, frankly, volatile international situations out there, the Iran-Israel dynamic.
Absolutely.
And we're putting Iran first here because, well, right now, the main action, the political stuff anyway, seems really centered on Iran.
That's right. The political maneuvering is intense.
So our mission today is to unpack the sources you've given us, pull out the key insights on this whole peril of reckless regime change idea, and, what the consequences might be.
Yeah, and there's some really surprising details when you start digging.
Definitely. Okay, so to kick things off, let's go right to the source of a lot of modern political, well, confusion. Donald Trump's social media.
Mm-hmm. X and Truth Social.
Right. He uses both, and it often feels like this stream of consciousness thing. But the key is he's the former president, potentially the next one, and he's doing foreign policy with these, semi-disjointed posts.
With zero diplomatic nuance, none at all.
Exactly. So one post calls for unconditional surrender from Iran.
Which is a huge demand.
Huge. And then another one, even more startling, hints at assassinating Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
That one caused a stir. The wording was specific, wasn't it?
It really was something like, we know where he is, but we will not take him out now. And then, just so there's no confusion, he adds the word kill.
Followed by, at least not for now. Chilling, really.
It is, and we need to understand who Khamenei is, right? He's not just a head of state for, 95 million people?
Over 95 million, yeah. But crucially, he's also seen as a supreme religious leader, especially for Shia Muslims.
Okay.
And that community is massive. You've got majority Shia populations in Iraq, Azerbaijan, and large groups in India, Pakistan, and elsewhere.
So the idea of assassinating him.
Well, even just talking about it is incredibly reckless. It's caused huge consternation globally.
Right.
And it's worth adding, Netanyahu hasn't explicitly said assassinate Khamenei. His defense minister, Israel Katz, did predict Khamenei would end up like Saddam Hussein.
Which is pretty suggestive.
Yeah.
So how did Khamenei himself react to this kind of extreme talk?
Khamenei put out a recorded video, and it was very defiant.
No surprise there, I guess.
Not really. He said there's no question of surrender. The Iranian nation shall never surrender. And he included a warning, basically saying American involvement would be the worst thing that can happen to them and would ultimately destroy Israel. Very, very defiant.
Wow. But then Trump tried to walk back the unconditional surrender part a bit.
Sort of. During one of his morning walkabouts, as he calls them, he gave this odd explanation.
What did he say?
He said unconditional surrender just means I've had it. Like he's exhausted with them.
That's quite an interpretation of a major foreign policy demand.
It is. He said it wasn't about government surrender. He compared Iran's death to America, death to Israel, chance to, schoolyard bully stuff that can't be accepted.
Okay. But on the nuclear issue, he didn't soften.
Not at all. His current stance is, we will not believe any guarantees or any agreement now if they give up their nukes. Full stop.
Dope.
He demands inspection rights and the ability to just blow it up and destroy it if they find anything objectionable.
That sounds incredibly aggressive.
It is. It actually reminds me of that old cap, roll, eliminate formula the non-proliferation people used against India's nuclear program back in the mid-90s.
Right, cap it, roll it back, eliminate it.
Exactly. But Trump seems to want to do all of that in one go. Much faster, much more forceful.
Okay, let's switch to Netanyahu. What's his angle been beyond his defense minister's comments?
Well, he told Fox News something interesting. He said regime change could certainly be the result because Iran is very weak. And then he added, the decision to act to rise up is at this time the decision of the Iranian people.
So he's appealing directly to Iranians.
Yes, even in his recorded messages, he's urged them to rise in revolt against the Ayatollah.
And when he was asked point blank about killing Khamenei on ABC News,
he didn't give a direct yes or no. He said it might bring an end to the conflict, which, again, is suggestive without being an explicit threat from him personally.
So we're looking at two, really extreme possibilities being floated. Forced regime change or assassinating Khamenei, which probably leads to regime change anyway.
Both seem like incredibly extreme measures, yeah.
So how are other major players reacting, particularly allies who might be a bit more cautious?
That's where someone like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, comes in. He's seen as a more, let's say, sensible voice among Western allies.
And what did he say?
He was quite clear. He said, We don't want Iran to get its nuclear weapon, but the biggest error would be to use military strikes to change the regime because it would then be chaos.
Chaos. Strong word.
Very. He urged a return to discussions as quickly as possible to figure out the nuclear and ballistic missile issues.
Did he back that up with history?
He did. He asked, does anyone think what happened in Iraq in 2003 was a good idea? Does anyone think what was done in Libya in the next decade was a good idea?
Pointed questions.
Absolutely. He also mentioned concern for regional friends like Iraq and Lebanon, saying they need stability, anything but chaos. His message is basically, look at the track record. Regime change wars often backfire badly.
Okay, let's dig into the assassination idea a bit more. You mentioned it might not actually be that hard, technically, for Israelis to target key people in Iran.
That's the assessment, yeah. Generals, scientists, intelligence figures. Their intelligence reach inside Iran seems significant.
But would it work?
Yeah.
Would taking out Khamenei actually achieve the desired result, or could it make things worse?
That's the core question, and the consensus seems to be probably not. First, Iran definitely has a succession plan.
Right.
Someone else would take over. And the worry is that successor might be even more radical than Khamenei.
Oh, interesting.
And you wouldn't just get a more radical leader, you'd likely get a more radicalized population, a more angry population.
How so?
Because even Iranians who dislike the current government, its restrictions, whatever, they might rally around a new sense of nationalism if their leader is assassinated by an external power.
A unifying effect, potentially.
Exactly. You have to remember, Iran isn't like some countries created after World War I. It's an ancient civilization. We're talking almost 4,000 years BC.
Wow.
It's a strong country, very cohesive nationalism. It's not going to just fall apart because you kill one leader. And outside power isn't just going to walk in.
So what's the likely outcome then?
More likely, a broken country.
Yeah.
A failed state, which happens to hold the world's third largest oil reserves.
That sounds like a recipe for global instability.
A terrible outcome. Plus, you'd anger Muslims worldwide, not just Shia. Remember, Iraq next door is majority Shia. You could see disturbances across the Middle East and beyond.
So the European allies.
They're reportedly leaning hard on the U.S. and Israel, saying even talking about assassination is a bad idea. Because ultimately, you need someone you can actually negotiate with. You can't negotiate with chaos.
Okay, so assassination looks incredibly risky. What about the broader idea of regime change, using military force, maybe just air power?
Well, there's some important analysis on that. Scholar Robert Pape, writing in Foreign Affairs, looked at the history of mass bombing campaigns going back to World War I.
Okay, and what did he find?
His key finding is pretty stark. No power has ever brought about regime change using only air attacks. Ever. Doesn't matter how dominant you are in the air.
Really? Never.
Never just with air power alone.
Right.
You need what the military calls a hammer and anvil.
Hammer and anvil.
Yeah. Ground forces act as the anvil. They corner the target, trap them. Then air power acts as the hammer to demolish them.
Can you give an example?
Gaddafi in Libya is a classic case. Rebel forces on the ground, supported by Western intelligence, acted as the anvil. They cornered Gaddafi. Then NATO air power came in as the hammer and, well, finished the job.
I see. So could that work in Iran?
That's the problem. It almost certainly couldn't.
Why not?
Well, who's going to be the anvil? The Israelis can't put boots on the ground in Iran in any significant way. They can't reach it easily, apart from secret agents.
And the Americans.
Even Trump, despite the rhetoric, would likely think twice, thrice, probably 10 times before putting U.S. troops into Iran.
It's just too big, too complicated.
Exactly. It's huge, complex, much bigger than Iraq. And unlike Iraq, it's not easily accessible from existing U.S. bases in the region for large-scale ground operations. You can be pretty sure he won't be putting troops in Iran.
So if hammer and anvil is out, what is Trump doing with all this talk? Is it just posturing?
A lot of it seems to be psychological warfare, yeah. Flexing American muscle, trying to threaten the Iranians.
But is there a military alternative being considered short of full regime change, maybe just targeting the nuclear program?
The sources suggest that's a possibility. Using things like B-2 stealth bombers armed with massive bunker buster bombs, 30,000 pounds, designed to penetrate deep underground.
To take out their nuclear facilities, like the Fordo site.
Precisely. To take out the Fordo facility, their main underground enrichment plant. The goal wouldn't be regime change, but to set back their nuclear program by a very long time. Similar, again, to what was done to Gaddafi's capabilities.
Okay. It really strikes me, looking at the region, how resources, especially oil, seem like both a blessing and a curse.
That's a very common observation, and it's largely true.
Why is that? How does it become a curse?
Well, it often comes down to institutions. In countries that like, proper systems, strong state structures, credible government, independent institutions,
Hmm.
having massive natural resources can actually backfire
Oh.
because it gives dictators or ruling elites easy money to finance their rule. They can use it to bribe the population, buy off opposition, or keep bigger global powers happy temporarily. It prevents the development of a more diverse economy or, frankly, democracy. You see this pattern in places like Venezuela, Iraq under Saddam, even Kuwait to some extent. The oil money props up regimes that might otherwise face more pressure to reform or be accountable,
Whereas countries with strong institutions?
like the US or Norway, for example. They have resources, but because they have strong democratic institutions, checks and balances, the resources don't become the same kind of political curse.
In this history, this reliance on oil and the foreign meddling it attracts surely plays into Iran's mindset today.
Absolutely. It creates deep suspicion of outsiders and their motives. Which brings us to some crucial Iranian history. We need to go back, way back to like 1949, 1950.
Okay, what happened then?
General Ali Reza took over as prime minister. Iran was caught right in the middle of the Cold War. You had the Soviets on one side, the US and Britain on the other, and everyone wanted control of Iranian oil.
Which the British were producing at the time.
Yes, through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But Ali Reza wanted to nationalize it, take control for Iran.
That must have caused tension.
Big time. It led to this long period of intrigue. We know now from declassified documents, British intelligence, MI6, and the American CIA basically got together.
To do what?
Well, in March 1951, Ali Reza was assassinated.
Assassinated.
Yes. His successor was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was seen as a leftist, or maybe left of center, and the Communist Tudeh Party was quite strong then.
And Mossadegh.
He also pushed to nationalize the oil industry. So by 1953.
Guess, another intervention.
Exactly. An American-British operation, codenamed Operation Ajax, approved by Churchill in the UK and President Eisenhower in the US. Mossadegh was overthrown.
What happened to him?
He spent the rest of his life under house arrest.
So, first, Ali Reza assassinated, then Mossadegh overthrown. A clear pattern of external meddling.
A very clear pattern.
Yeah.
And who did the US and UK support after that?
The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Precisely. They propped him up, tried to make him seem like a credible, modernizing leader.
But he became more of a dictator, right? Despite Iran having, as you said, a well-educated population.
He did. A very rich dictator. Iran had talent, high education levels, but the wealth didn't translate into broad prosperity or freedom.
I remember reading about some joint venture he had with India in the 70s.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting footnote. With Mrs. Gandhi's government, the Kujamukh Iron Ore Company in Karnataka, the idea was to mine iron ore there and export it to Iran for steel production.
Did it work?
Not really. It died pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because by the late 1970s, the Shah was facing huge protests. The situation was becoming unstable.
And that led to the 1979 revolution.
Exactly. The Shah went into exile in January 1979, and Ayatollah Khamenei returned from his exile.
And what were the immediate consequences of that revolution? Because revolutions often eat their own, don't they?
They certainly can. And in Iran, some of the first victims were actually the leftists and communists who had also fought against the Shah.
Really?
Oh, yes. They were mass slaughtered or jailed by the new Islamic regime. And then, of course, came the event many Americans remember vividly.
The U.S. Embassy hostage crisis.
Right. The ransacking of the embassy, the 444 days the hostages were held, that whole crisis arguably cost Jimmy Carter his re-election.
It just shows the sheer complexity of Iran, doesn't it?
It really does. And that history is crucial. Thinking you can just, get rid of the supreme leader and everything changes. It ignores these deep roots.
There will still be ayatollahs, mosques.
Exactly. The seminaries in Qom, which is a major holy city for Shia Muslims, these fundamental structures aren't just going to disappear. History strongly suggests that trying to force radical change from the outside often leads to, well, unintended and usually worse outcomes.
Let's broaden out again then.
Yeah.
Macron mentioned Iraq in 2003. That seems like the prime example of unintended consequences after regime change.
It's a very stark example, yes. The U.S. and allies succeeded in removing Saddam Hussein, which they hadn't managed in the first Gulf War using mainly air power. They occupied Baghdad.
But it backfired.
Massively. You could call it a huge self-goal for Western power and influence in the region.
How so?
Well, think about it. Saddam was Sunni, but he ruled a majority Shia country. In a brutal way, yes, but he contained Shia influence regionally, which Iran represents.
Okay.
So the U.S. brings democracy, the Shia majority wins elections, which is democratic, but what happens to the Sunni minority, especially Saddam's former military, his elite Republican Guard?
Where did they go?
Many of them felt disenfranchised, persecuted, and they formed the backbone of the insurgency, and crucially, many joined extremist groups. They eventually became key parts of ISIS.
So Saddam's old guard helped form ISIS.
A significant portion, yes. They took control of Mosul, and al-Qaeda, which was actually on the decline after 9/11, found new life, new recruits, and new territory in the chaos of post-Saddam Iraq.
And morphed into ISIS.
Pretty much. With its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, eventually based near Baghdad, it's just a really powerful lesson in how doing radical things in complex regions you don't fully grasp.
Or regions that aren't ready for that kind of change.
Exactly. It can have devastating, long-lasting, unintended consequences.
And Iraq isn't the only example from that era, is it? The Arab Spring had mixed results too.
Very mixed, mostly negative in the long run. Look at Syria. A brutal, decade-long civil war, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced.
Libya.
Still divided, unstable, basically a failed state in many ways. Years after the intervention that removed Gaddafi.
Egypt.
Had that brief moment, that flirtation with democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood won elections.
And then?
Then the military stepped back in, and now they have another military strongman, arguably more repressive than Mubarak was before the Arab Spring.
And then there's Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yeah. The U.S. and allies went in after 9/11, initially to get bin Laden, but it quickly morphed into nation-building regime change.
Billions, maybe trillions spent.
Tens of billions, certainly. Some estimates say a couple of $1 trillion over 20 years, all for the regime they built to collapse almost overnight.
And the Taliban walks straight back into power.
Exactly. It's just staggering when you look at the pattern.
And the ripple effects go beyond the Middle East, don't they?
Absolutely. One of the biggest impacts of all this instability, Iraq, Syria, Libya, has been the massive streams of refugees heading towards Europe.
Which has had huge political consequences there.
Huge. It arguably broke the consensus politics in many European countries, fueling the rise of hard-right anti-immigration parties across the continent. The political landscape of Europe today is profoundly shaped by the fallout from these interventions.
So summing up this historical pattern, we're talking about countries that often lack strong institutions, don't have a history of peaceful power transfers. Maybe they've always been monarchies or theocracies.
Right. They're just not structured, not ready historically or culturally, perhaps, for the kind of rapid, externally imposed change that was attempted.
Which makes trying to force it
very, very reckless. You're messing with incredibly complex systems with deep histories.
And yet we still hear this talk. Trump's rhetoric, even if, as the Wall Street Journal noted, he sometimes tends to chicken out later.
Right. He might back down from the most extreme rhetoric eventually.
But Netanyahu also talks about regime change being a potential outcome.
He does. And that's really the point of this deep dive, isn't it? To lay out all the factors, all the history, to show just how incredibly fraught this path is, how packed it is with potential unintended consequences.
Especially this loose talk about assassinating the Ayatollah, which the sources clearly view as a terrible idea.
A profoundly bad idea based on this analysis, yeah. So as you, the listener, think about all this, just consider that weight of history, the patterns, the complexities of a place like Iran, an ancient civilization.
It leads to a tough question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given everything we've just discussed, all these historical lessons, how do you weigh that understandable impulse for immediate action, maybe against a perceived threat, versus the very real, historically demonstrated potential for unleashing long-term, unforeseen chaos in a world that's completely interconnected?
That's the dilemma.
It's definitely something to mull over. We really encourage you to keep exploring these complex issues, thinking about the role of diplomacy, or the lack of it and its impact on keeping our world stable or making it much less so.